All right, hi. Welcome, class. This is Daniel Estrada. This is HSS 405, Autonomy and AI. This video is supposed to be the makeup lecture for the missed snow day on February 9th. So I want to make sure that we don't fall behind in the syllabus, so I'm recording this lecture. Let's go ahead and jump into the class. So on February 9th, we're supposed to be finishing up our Aristotle discussion. Next week we go into Kant. We'll talk about artificial life and neo-mechanism over the next few weeks. Remember, you have a bunch of assignments coming up. Next week you have your second thought paper. So keep those assignments in mind. You also have to be doing class notes for the readings over these few weeks. You have your midterm coming up also. And we can talk about that more in class next week. But just keep your eye on these assignments. So we're in Aristotle. We talked a little bit about Aristotle last time. I'm going to jump back into the slides, finish some things up about Aristotle, get us ready to transition to Kant next week. All right, let's go back into the slides here. So, yeah, we're talking about Aristotle. Remember, the big thing that we're talking about is Aristotle's view of purpose, this idea of final cause, what it's for, telos, right, study of teleology. And we spent a little bit of time last time on Tuesday talking about the difference between essentialism and functionalism. The modern view is a functionalist view, and Aristotle's view is an essentialist view. And we started putting a little bit of meat on those bones last time, talking about how stuff comes together into a particular form to make a substance. All the things are substances, so you're a substance. FMH is a substance. And Aristotle's Metaphysics is explaining what substances are, and the key to understand about Aristotle's Metaphysics is that the kind of thing you are, it gets classified in these nested ways. So you can go down this sort of hierarchy of being. We started talking about this a little bit last time. I drew up this image. I don't know if this image is very helpful. It's maybe more confusing. But the idea is to give a little picture of the hierarchy that he's developing here, right? So there's potentiality and actuality, the hylomorphism, comes together to be a substance. And then in Aristotle's view, there's three kinds of substances. We talked about this last time. There's the inanimate substances described by physics. The inanimate substances are the ones that move from some external force applied to it. And so Aristotle explains the inanimate substances in his physics. Physics, for Aristotle's discussion of how things move, inanimate objects move in a particular way. But there's different kinds of substances for Aristotle besides the inanimate objects. There's also the animate objects. The animate creatures have a soul, right? Animate here just means having a soul. And what Aristotle means by a soul is that it has an internal drive. So unlike the merely physical objects that move from external forces, animate objects move from some internal drive, right? So my cat, if I put my cat on the table, eventually it'll go find food, it'll go do something else, because there's internal drives that move it, right? So if my cat gets hungry, it'll go find food, not because some external force was applied to it, but because of this internal drive, hunger. Aristotle, we saw last time, also thinks that there's the eternal substances, like the stars and the sun and the moon and the planets, that move in these eternal patterns. These patterns are different from the inanimate or the animate objects. So Aristotle didn't think that the sun and the moon were animate. He didn't think they had souls. He thought that they moved in these special patterns, special kinds of objects. Right, and we can dive down deeper into this hierarchy, right? So for each of these topics, Aristotle says a whole bunch of things, but he spends a lot of his time talking about the animate creatures. He spends a lot of time talking about biology, and in particular, so we can go into the animate creatures. There's three different kinds of souls, sort of again nested, so that the highest kind of soul has all the others inside of it. But and we talked about this on Tuesday also, just a little bit of review. The simplest kind of soul is the one that plants also have. We share this kind of soul with the plants, is the appetitive soul, right? It seeks food and shelter, reproduction. The basic sort of drives to stay alive. Nowadays we talk about Maslow's hierarchy, is a more common way of talking about this. Hierarchy of needs. I think we might even mention this in class. There's a physiological, biological needs, safety, right? So this goes all the way up to human self-actualization. For Aristotle has a simpler hierarchy. The simplest thing is the food. All other kinds of souls have this drive for food and shelter, basic needs. And even plants have this kind of need. But when you get to the animals, they're more complicated. Animals have a sensation, especially sensations for pain and pleasure. For Aristotle, the basic kind of sensitivity is sensitivity to pain and pleasure. So Aristotle isn't really thinking about vision versus taste versus hearing. He talks about these things also, but Aristotle thinks that the basic kind of sensitivity is sensitivity to pain and pleasure. And this is what gets animals to move around, right? So plants don't feel pain and pleasure, they just sit still, but animals move around. And in particular, they move around to increase their pleasure and decrease their pain, right? To seek more pleasure and to avoid pain. So when my cat is sitting there and gets hungry, that hunger is a kind of pain. In order to get rid of that hunger, it needs to go find food. So the pain moves it to go find food, which will be pleasurable and eliminate the pain. Right? So that's why the animal moves around, according to Aristotle. It's the sensitivity to pain and pleasure. And that's what's characteristic about the animals, right? When animals move with an internal drive, it's usually a drive out of responding to pain and pleasure, right? So that's the sensitivity is how Aristotle explains why the animate creatures move the way they do. And it's sophisticated, right? Because he recognizes even though plants don't move around, they're doing like a sort of minimal version of the same thing that the animals are doing. Right? Being able to recognize this commonality between plants and animals and sort of fit it into this theoretical superstructure. This is one of the reasons why Aristotle is so interesting. But the parts of the soul don't just stop at the sensitive, they go on to the rational. So human beings, for Aristotle, are the rational creatures. Right? We're not mere animals, but we're animals with this additional capacity, this additional way we move. And that additional capacity is rationality for Aristotle. We're rational, and when he says we're rational, he doesn't mean we're sort of robotic calculators, right? Those are Vulcans, where we only do the logical thing. But Aristotle just means that we're sensitive to reasons, that we offer reasons for why we do things. Those reasons can be manipulated both by logic and by rhetoric, right? By sort of verbal manipulation. Right? They're sensitive to things like evidence. Reasons here doesn't just mean logical reasons, but it means any kind of reasons, any kind of motivating reasons. So we have motivations that take this sort of rational form and not merely pain and pleasure. On Aristotle's view, what makes humans unique is that we don't merely seek the pain and pleasure, we also seek a satisfaction of reason, or of logic, of evidence. Right, we have other motivations besides mere pain and pleasure that move us. This is, you might remember from Frankfurt's discussion of the wanton, right? The wanton sort of merely acts on their desires, doesn't really think about what desires they have. Right? A rational person can think about what desires they have, right? And they can weigh those desires against things that they know, right? So, maybe smoking feels good, right? It gives me some kind of pleasure, but rationally I know that smoking will kill me, right? So I don't smoke, and that's a reason that goes beyond my immediate pain and pleasure. Right, so I can delay my pain and pleasure. Eating this cake, right, shoving this cake in my face would be pleasurable, but I know that in a few hours I'll regret it. Right, tomorrow morning I'll be in my stomach will regret it. Right, so because I know rationally this future state of pain and pleasure, I can use that to adjust my behaviors right now. And this is something that Aristotle doesn't think the animals can do, or at least they can't do very well, is to avoid their immediate pains and pleasures for the sake of reason and logic, for the sake of what they know about the world. So on Aristotle's view, the rational creatures behave differently. Right? Humans are rational creatures, and we behave differently than the rest of the animals because we're driven by this additional kind of thing, right? Reason and logic. And for Aristotle, this makes us not just rational creatures, but it makes us political creatures, right? This is not just how we engage sort of logical computation. This is how we engage each other in a social world, right? So Aristotle calls us zoon politikon, the political animal, right? So we're not just a rational animal. We're not just merely a sensitive animal. We're more than merely sensitive. We're also rational, and reason gives us the capacity for political engagement, social engagement. And Aristotle even breaks this down further. So different kinds of rationality, right? Different kinds of what he calls the virtues of thought. So the virtues of thought are the ways in which thinking goes well. Not all ways of thinking go well. He also talks about beliefs and opinions. And beliefs and opinions might be, they can be wrong. They can be bad for a person on Aristotle's view, you could have a bad opinion, an opinion that's not good for you. But the virtues of thought, right? So opinions are one kind of thing. Virtues of thought are another kind of thing. And Aristotle thinks that there's something virtuous about these forms of thinking, and we'll get into that. Yeah, so I just went through this in some detail. The tripartite view of the soul, the appetitive soul, all creatures have it. The sensitive soul, only the animals have it. It gives them sentience, and that's why they move around. Rational soul gives us contemplation, and ethics, and friendship, and so on. This is a classic view, sometimes called the Great Chain of Being. The Great Chain of Being is the idea that all the structure of things has this natural hierarchy from the lowest things to the highest things. This isn't just Aristotle's view. But Aristotle is a big proponent of this view. This goes basically all throughout the ancient world, where there's the minerals and then the vegetables and then the animals, right? And then there's the people who are rational, and then above the people are the angels, and then God above that, and then maybe lower than the minerals or the evil things, the devils, and so on. And this sort of great chain of being, this natural hierarchy of the natural order of things, the idea that human beings are naturally above all the animals and all the plants and so on. And this isn't unique to Aristotle's view. In fact, you find this all over the place in the ancient world. But this is a view that Aristotle champions. Okay, so I want to go through these virtues of thought in a little bit more detail, partly because they'll come up again when we do the artificial intelligence debate. So my plan is to go through these virtues of thought and then consider how these have influenced the contemporary debate over artificial intelligence, and then think a little bit about how it's influenced other areas of science. So let's talk about the virtues of thought here. So these virtues of thought, remember, are the ways in which thinking go well. Aristotle says there's 5 virtues of thought, 5 different ways of thinking that explain how human rationality sort of works. Episteme, so these are the Greek terms: episteme, techne, phronesis, nous, and sophia. Episteme is knowledge. If you hear anyone say the word epistemology, epistemology means knowledge or study of knowledge. Knowledge, for Aristotle here, episteme means scientific knowledge, and it means both are sort of logical computations, mathematics, logic, deduction, induction, inference, right, these kinds of things. But episteme also means sort of deduction from bits of evidence, right? So if you know something about a thing, then you can deduce from that other things, right? This is how inference works. This is how science works on Aristotle's view. Aristotle thinks that science is a kind of knowledge. It's a knowledge based on logic plus empirical studies. So episteme is scientific knowledge, and Aristotle famously distinguishes scientific knowledge from what he calls techne, or craft knowledge. Craft knowledge, you might think of like a skill. So one way of classic way of making this distinction is between book smarts and street smarts. Right, the book smarts are the things you know from books, and the street smarts are the things you can do. Right, the skills you have, the capacities and abilities that you have to get around in the world. And these are more than just things you know, right? So you might have a lot of book smarts, you might know a lot of facts, you might be able to do logic really well, but you might not have any idea of how to do anything in the world. And vice versa, right? You might be really talented, have a lot of skills in negotiating the world, but you might not know a whole lot of facts, or you might not be all that good at math and that kind of stuff. Right? So Aristotle distinguishes these two, episteme and techne. Episteme is the scientific knowledge and deduction. Techne is craft knowledge, it's skills that are developed through practice, right? So Aristotle is thinking about the crafts person, someone who has developed the blacksmith, right? The blacksmith who knows how to work metal, how to combine metals and form metals into a sword or whatever, into a spear, right? That's the kind of thing that it takes practice to develop. You have to learn how to do it, to sort of apprenticeship into mastery, right? Develop that skill. It's something that's not just a matter of knowing a bunch of facts, but it's a matter of actually practicing the behavior sort of in an embodied way. The way that philosophers talk about this nowadays is the difference between knowing how and knowing that. Right? So I know that Washington, D.C. is the capital of the United States. Right? It's a fact I know. You can write it in a book or in a textbook, and I can study that fact in the book. Right? So I know that Washington, D.C. is capital United States, but I know how to ride a bike. My knowledge of how to ride a bike isn't just an accumulation of facts. It's an effort of practice that I've accumulated over lots of hours of riding bikes, lots of falling down, right, lots of missteps, and learning how to correct those mistakes. I'm often knowing how and knowing that there's ways they're compatible, but sometimes they also run into conflict. If you ask someone to if you ask someone who's shooting a free throw, if you ask them to explain exactly what they're doing, exactly how they're holding their hands, exactly which muscles they're flexing in order to shoot the basket, chances are if they're explaining it, they're probably going to miss the shot, right? Because explaining all those things is different from actually doing them. Right? So the techne is about actually doing them, is knowing how to do them, is having that skill to actually produce the thing. And episteme is the facts and logic that goes in behind it. Techne is where we get our word technology. Right? So technology is a kind, originally technology or technique. Technique, these are kinds of crafts, kinds of skills. Aristotle goes through all of this in this article I put up on Nicomachean Ethics. Let me pull this out. Yeah, so the Nicomachean Ethics, he goes over the different kinds of knowledge, and this is all in the class notes. I have the section from De Anima where he goes over the different parts of the soul, and Nicomachean Ethics where he goes over the virtues of thought. And you can look at this where he talks about the different virtues of thought explicitly. And the thing about craft knowledge that makes them different from all the other kinds of knowledge, I mean, all the other different virtues of thought, is that craft knowledge is concerned with production and not action. In other words, craft knowledge is concerned with the means and not the end. And Aristotle recognizes that sometimes you can have a craft that's for a bad end. And in fact, you can be really good at that craft, but it's used badly, right? So I can be, for instance, I can be a skilled thief. Thievery, right? I mean, to do it well, it might take practice. You might have to practice a bunch of times, you might get caught a bunch of times and have to learn how to do it better, right? But eventually you might become a really proficient thief. And Aristotle's going to say, well, look, it's a skill that you've developed, and so in that sense it's a good, but it's being applied for bad ends, right? And for Aristotle, techne is the only thing on this list that can do this. Everything else can only be applied to good ends, he thinks. But it's techne that has this, that is concerned with production and not action. And he links it to money. Craft is fond of fortune, and fortune fond of craft, right? So sometimes you don't just do it. You don't just pick up a trade because it's good for you, but you do it because it'll make you rich. It'll sort of satisfy these other ends that might not be good, right? Greed and so on. Okay, knowing how versus knowing that. This stuff will come up important in artificial intelligence, partly because it's a challenge for robots to know how to do things rather than know just a bunch of facts, right? So we expect robots to be able to have a bunch of facts at their command and be able to deduce logically from those facts. But being able to have an embodied skill, like driving a car or shooting a free throw, right? These are things that require practice and that robots aren't really as good at. Yep, semi. Okay. Let me just push through these. Phronesis. Phronesis is Aristotle's word for intelligence. Intelligence is different from just knowing things or being able to compute from the things that you know. Intelligence is also different from having skills. For Aristotle, phronesis is about your capacity to acquire the good. Did I go through this already? No, I skipped this. Yeah, let me jump ahead really quickly. During the free will debate, we got into a discussion about GTA 5, how Grand Theft Auto is this open world game, and you can sort of do anything you want in it, and so there's no end goal that you have to follow. You can sort of wander around and do whatever you want. I mean, that means that you might not actually get through the game storyline. You might not actually finish the game because it's an open world. There's this possibilities for doing different kinds of things. That was useful for talking about the free will debate. Aristotle has a similar kind of example that he uses when he's talking about the good. So the example is of archery. So they didn't have video games back in the day. They had archers and archery. Right? So you're an archer, you have a bow and arrow, and you're trying to get to the bullseye. Aristotle's idea is that we all want to hit the bullseye. So think of the bullseye as the good. as the good that we all want to achieve. Right? We have ends that we're trying to achieve, and there's a right way of doing it, and the right way of doing it would be hitting that bullseye. Right? So there's some goal in the future that we want to accomplish. We want to be a doctor. We want to be an engineer. We want to be an astronaut. We want to have $1 million. We want to start our own business. These kinds of things. Right? So that's a goal that we can achieve. Right? That's an aim that we have set up for us. It's a telos that we're aiming for. And the goal is to hit that bullseye. And on Aristotle's view, every creature wants to hit the bullseye. Even the animals, even the plants. There's something that's good for the animals and the plants. There's a good that they're trying to achieve. And they either hit it or they don't, right? There's their ability to hit it or they can miss, right? So when I try to hit the bullseye, sometimes I hit the bullseye, and sometimes there's variations either with how I aim my my bow and arrow, or with what happens, if there's a gust of wind or something, maybe that affects whether I hit the bullseye. But in Aristotle's view, every creature wants to hit the bullseye. Every creature is aiming for the bullseye, and they just do better or worse at hitting it. And not only is everyone trying to hit the bullseye, but in some sense, there's a different bullseye for every kind of creature, right? So different animals have different goods. What's good for a cat is different from what's good for me, right? Cats have different dietary requirements. They have different sleep requirements. They have different entertainment requirements from me. And the plant in my house has different requirements still. Right? The plant needs different water and food it needs than both me and the cat. But despite our differences, on Aristotle's view, we're all still aiming at the good. Even the good is different for each of us, but we're still trying to aim at some ultimate good. Aristotle calls the good that we're aiming at, he calls it eudaimonia, eu meaning good, and daimon meaning spirit. So like good spirit, good-spirited, the good life. This is how it's often translated, the good life. But when Aristotle says that we're aiming for the good life, and so the cat's also aiming for the cat good life, and the plant is also aiming for the plant's good life. When we say good life, we don't just mean the life of pleasure, really. It's not just sort of a hedonist life, not like the heroin junkie. It might be feeling good, but maybe that's not a good life. For Aristotle, what a good life is doing well. You might think of it in terms of health, but not just physical health, but health in sort of all respects, psychological health, social health, doing well, flourishing the way a garden might flourish. Right, so there's a clear biological, scientific distinction between, when a garden is doing well, it's productive, the flowers are blooming, the seeds are sprouting, the fruit is being born, that kind of stuff. So there's a clear distinction between when the garden's doing well and when the garden's failing, when all the plants are dying, when none of the flowers are blooming, when everything's wilting and dying. Maybe there's some ambiguities in between. Maybe there's some cases where it's not clear if the garden is doing well or is doing poorly. But at the extremes, there's a clear, scientifically legitimate distinction between doing well, being healthy, and doing poorly, dying. And Aristotle thinks that all creatures, no matter their kind, are trying to do well. Right? So on Aristotle's view, all these creatures have different means for accomplishing this goal, different means for hitting that bullseye, right? Different instruments, right? So the cat has its claws, right, and it has its whiskers, right? These are the tools that it has for accomplishing its own goals. The plant has other techniques for doing well, and humans have their own techniques also. Humans are the rational animals. We have rationality as our capacity for doing well. I have this video on the page. I'm probably not going to play the whole thing. But this is you should watch it. It's on the slides. This is the endurance hunt. These are human beings from the Serengeti Desert in Africa, doing what some anthropologists consider one of the oldest forms of hunting. This is the endurance hunt. Human beings run on 2 legs, which is more efficient over long distances than running on 4 legs. And one of the things that means is that you can outrun your prey. And so this is a video of some people doing this traditional hunt for prey, where over 8 hours, this guy runs down a kudu. I'll show you the kudu. Yeah, this big kudu. He runs it down. He eventually finds it and kills it. He's able to kill it. It just collapses on its own because it's exhausted, and the human being sort of out tires it. But he goes ahead and hits it with the spear anyway. But it's not just his holding the spear, but it's also the fact that he has the capacity for. So the 2 legs is more efficient. Running on 2 legs is more efficient than running on 4 legs. He sweats all over his body. Most animals don't have as many sweat glands and so can't manage their temperature as well. We can carry things, right? We have 2 free hands to carry things like water, so we can replenish everything we lose as sweat. But we also, more importantly, have the capacity for deduction. So there's several times in this video where the hunters have to figure out which way the animal went, right? They have to track the footsteps. In this case, the animal stops for a bit under this tree to get some shade, and the hunter has to deduce the direction that he goes. And so it's this kind of mental capacity, or it's this kind of reasoning from evidence that allows the human being its tools to survive. On Aristotle's view, this, in some sense, this makes us better than the animals because we have this additional capacity. But in some sense, this is just another tool that we have to accomplish our goals. All the animals are trying to accomplish their goals, and this is just how we do it, right? This is just the tools that we have to do it. Okay. So phronesis, intelligence, is for Aristotle, it's a measure of how well we can accomplish these goals. How able are we to get to accomplish our ends? Right? The more intelligent we are, the better we are at accomplishing our ends. Notice that knowing a lot of things doesn't necessarily accomplish your ends, and having a lot of skills also doesn't necessarily accomplish your ends. Intelligence is the capacity to hit our goal, to hit that bullseye. Some people are better or worse than it, and for Aristotle, that's what makes you more or less intelligent. The more intelligent you are, the better you're able to accomplish your goals. You might think of like the panda bear. Panda bear eats bamboo. Bamboo is really hard to digest. The panda bears they've evolved special capacities to digest this food. But it also means that they don't live all over the place. They're sort of confined to special locations, and they have a lot of trouble breeding. They're sort of an endangered species as a result. So they have skills, right? They have the skill to digest the bamboo, but maybe it's not the most intelligent strategy, right? Because it's harder to accomplish that task than it is to accomplish other tasks. Right? The grizzly bear is not so limited in its diet. It can eat just about whatever it wants. Maybe that makes it easier for it to accomplish its goals. And in fact, this is what you see from the more clever animals there are the ones that can figure out different ways of accomplishing their goals. A lot of urban animals, like the raccoon or the possum, they're part of the reason that they're successful is because they're really clever. They know how to get into trash cans and so on. Right? That kind of cleverness is where their success lies. So the more intelligent you are, the better you're able to accomplish your ends. This leads to one of my sort of favorite definitions of intelligence, and this will be useful when we get to artificial intelligence. I believe this was an artificial intelligence person, and I think it might be Minsky, but it might be wrong. I'll look it up. But the distinction about intelligence, so intelligent creatures are able to accomplish their goals. Their goals are what they want to do, right? So intelligent creatures are better able to do what they want to do. So consider magnets. Magnets want to be stuck to each other, right? Positive to negative ends. Right? If you take 2 magnets together, they move to each other. Now you might think of this as a kind of rudimentary desire. Magnets want to be next to each other. But magnets are not very intelligent. And what I mean by that is that magnets don't have a lot of resources for coming in contact with each other. If I were to put a wall between 2 magnets, then the magnets they might stick to both sides of the wall, but they're not going to do anything more than just stick to the opposite sides of the wall. Romeo and Juliet are different. Romeo and Juliet are intelligent. If I were to stick Romeo and Juliet on opposite sides of the wall, they won't just stick to Romeo and Juliet want to be together, right? They have a goal of being as close to each other as possible. But if I put a wall between them, they don't just stick to the opposite sides of the wall. Romeo and Juliet are intelligent. They have other means of overcoming this obstacle, right? They can climb over the wall, they can get a ladder, right? They can knock the wall down, they can find a door. There's lots of things they can do to overcome this obstacle. That's what makes Romeo and Juliet intelligent. is that they have a goal, but they have lots of means of accomplishing that goal. The magnets also have a goal, but they are much less capable. They have a lot less resources for accomplishing that goal. Romeo and Juliet have lots of options. So notice that this distinction between what the magnets do and what Romeo and Juliet does, it's not really a distinction about their motivations, it's a distinction about their capacities. Both of them want to be next to each other, but one of them has a lot more resources for accomplishing that goal than the other. Okay, the last two virtues of thought I won't say a whole lot about. Nous is different from the others. Aristotle calls, Aristotle, nous is translated often as understanding. What Aristotle says about nous is that understanding is understanding of first principles. So there's deduction that we do when we have knowledge, scientific knowledge. We can deduce 1 + 1 is 2, and so on. But nous understanding requires understanding of first principles. Aristotle thinks that the basic principles of logic, the principle of non-contradiction, that it can't both be the case that P and not P. These are the kinds of things that are, Aristotle thinks you can't prove them, but they're required for proving everything else. And so what understanding is knowing these basic unprovable first principles. Now, this will become important later on because some philosophers will argue that computers don't understand things. It's not that they can't be intelligent, it's not that they can't accomplish a goal. Computers can accomplish goals, it's just they don't understand what they're doing when they accomplish these goals. Right? So they lack an appreciation of the first principles that make this intelligent behavior meaningful. So we'll see that Searle gives this kind of argument later on. The last virtue of thought is Sophia, wisdom. Philosophers, philosophia is love of wisdom. So philosophers are lovers of wisdom. Sophia means wisdom. On Aristotle's view, wisdom is gained from experience, and it's a sort of combination of phronesis and nous. It's a combination of intelligence and understanding. So the wise person is usually old, and wisdom comes with age, and what comes with age is experience. So the wise people know a lot of things, but they don't. It's not just they know a lot of facts. It's not just they have particular skills, but they've seen a lot of things happen, and so they have a base of understanding that's just a lot broader than other people. If I want to buy a house, and I might ask my dad for advice on how to buy a house. It's not because my dad is more educated than me, knows more facts, really. It's not a matter of facts. It's because he has more experience. He's done it before. That might not make him the best person in the world. Maybe he's not the most knowledgeable person in the world. Maybe he doesn't have a lot of skill. But just because he has a lot of experience, he has some wisdom to offer. Okay, those are the virtues of thought. Remember, virtues of thought are sort of the capacities of rational animals to engage their world. Yeah, and we talked about accomplishing a goal, this sort of instrumental arc. Being able to accomplish the goal makes you intelligent on Aristotle's view. So when we talk about artificial intelligence, sometimes what we're talking about is the capacity for machines to accomplish their goals. When a machine can perform a task successfully, sometimes we call that intelligence. Sometimes it looks like intelligence. Sometimes we'll treat that as intelligence. Okay, so I want to say just a few things about how Aristotle's view has impacted AI. So sort of the things in Aristotle's view that have an impact. I've mentioned some of these things already, but I just want to make sure that all this stuff is clear. The first thing to say is just this distinction between the animate and the inanimate, or having a soul and not having a soul. Right? Aristotle has this distinction between the creatures that move from an internal drive, the animate creatures, and the creatures that move from external forces, the inanimate creatures. If you have an Aristotelian view, if you think this distinction makes sense, then you might think that robots are not animate, that they don't have a soul, that they don't have an internal drive, the way that other animals do. Right? There's nothing driving them from within, you might think, and this is often what people say, that robots don't have a soul, they're entirely programmed. And the implication here is that all of the force driving them is from without and not from within. It's not an internal drive, it's an external, it's programming from someone else. And if you think that robots don't have a soul in this way, they don't have some internal drive, then you might also think, along with Aristotle, that they're not genuinely sensitive, they don't actually feel pain and pleasure. They might act in a way that looks like pain and pleasure, but that's all the program, that's just these external forces, that's not this internal drive, that's not genuine response to pain and pleasure, that's not genuine sensitivity. And if they're not genuinely sensitive in this way, if they're not genuinely animate, then they're simply not capable of rational human agency, right? So the first thing to say here is that a lot of people who object to AI, they object to AI on these Aristotelian grounds, on the grounds of a distinction between the animate and the inanimate. Sometimes they might put that in terms of a soul. Sometimes they might put that in terms of feeling pain and pleasure, or some other kind of internal motivation. Sometimes they might put that in terms of the programming, that this external programming is what drives them. Right? But these are all Aristotelian kinds of objections to AI. Another place where Aristotle's view comes in here is this phronesis versus techne, the difference between intelligence and technique. In particular, if we think about robots or AI as technology, if we think about it as merely technical, right, then on Aristotle's distinctions here, it's not really intelligent, right? It's not really trying to accomplish its own goals. It's merely an instrument for someone else to accomplish their own goals, right? So the calculator doesn't really understand math. It's a tool that I use to understand math, right? So the calculator is just a technique. It's not really intelligent. I'm the intelligent thing that's using these technologies in order to accomplish my ends. Another way to put this is that the technology doesn't really have ends in itself. It only has the ends that I give it as a tool. Right, so the technology isn't really pursuing the good. It's merely a means and not an end in itself. Doesn't have capacity for intelligence. One implication of this is that it won't have a capacity for understanding either. Nous. And we see this argument very explicitly in Searle's Chinese room argument, that the technology is merely a tool. It doesn't really understand anything itself. It's just a tool for my understanding. So I think these kinds of takes on artificial intelligence are very common. We'll see them again when we start talking about AI directly. But I think these things are very common, and they have this very long history going back for thousands of years in philosophy. And the really important thing to understand about these distinctions is that modern science doesn't believe them. Modern science does not hold an animate versus inanimate distinction. There's no animate driving the biological systems. There's no soul in the machine. Modern science thinks that animate creatures are just sophisticated organizations, sophisticated systems of inanimate stuff, that you're made of a bunch of inanimate stuff, just organized in the right sort of way so that it does all the biological activity. In other words, this first distinction is not a deep distinction on Aristotle's view. And if it's not a deep distinction, then maybe all of the objections that result from it also fall away. The same thing with intelligence and technique. We'll see later on next week the relationship between the tools that we use and the intelligence that we have. In fact, our intelligence is made of tools. The reason that we're intelligent is because we know how to use all these tools. Right? So these things aren't separate, but these things are intimately tied. And so if we can't draw this distinction between the intelligent things and the tools, then maybe these kinds of objections to AI also get undermined. Maybe this went too fast. Maybe you're not seeing the big picture here. We're going to go over AI arguments for and against AI in a lot more detail. I'm just here because we've been going over Aristotle. I'm just flagging this as some places where this is going to be relevant for these future debates. That was sort of the negative influence of Aristotle. These are things that Aristotle thought that sort of still have a place in the debates today, but I think are out of step with modern science. But there's other things that are maybe more compelling from a modern perspective that you also find in Aristotle. So the big thing for me is that Aristotle's talking about a nested hierarchy of agents, right? He has this structure where there's this hierarchy of how all the agents relate to each other. And I think it's very sophisticated, and I think, in fact, that modern science has a little bit to learn from it. It's intuitive, but I don't think modern science has totally got their heads around why it's so important. So there's lots of reasons why it's important. That the agents are made of other agents, right? So because agents are made of other agents, there's this hierarchy of agents that explains the kinds of things they are. And importantly, that these agents are hierarchically arranged or functionally arranged by their functional type, right? So the organization of this structure follows the functional organization of the organisms. We'll see how this works in just a second. The really important thing here is that the functional role means that these functional parts are oriented towards a goal, that they have a telos, that there's a bullseye that they're aiming at, right? That the functional parts of a system have goals, and that the accomplishing of these goals is what structures the overall system. Right? So this orientation towards goals, I want to say, is an essential property of agents. And I want to say this knowing that essentialism is a tricky thing here, but that what it means to be an agent, for any kind of agent, including the artificial agents, artificial intelligence, is that it's oriented towards some goal. There's something that it's trying to accomplish. There's some bullseye that it's aimed at. And Aristotle's view is interesting because he recognizes that the parts of systems are aimed at goals, and that the way that those systems come together can accomplish higher order goals. And this is all sort of baked into the languages that he's using. So Aristotle talks about organs, and organ systems, and organisms, and organization. Right? These words in Latin is organon, comes from the Greek organon, which means an instrument or a tool. This is the same word that we get organism, but also orgasm, orgy, organ system, organize, organization. Right? These are all, right? So an organ is a tool, is an instrument for its containing system. An organ plays an instrumental role for an organism. You can even trace this back further to the Proto-Indo-European languages, from which Latin and Greek and all these languages come. The root here is werg, or erg. Organize is the variation of this. And the root here just means to do, or to do work. Right? So an organ does work for an organism. An organ plays an instrumental role in the structure of the organism. Now, Aristotle thought that these roles, these instrumental roles, had to do with the essence of a thing, or the kind of thing it is. So humans are the rational animal. That's the kind of thing we are. We have certain organs, right? In particular, the rational parts of our soul, that do certain kinds of work, evaluate certain kinds of evidence, or right, make certain kinds of reasons, accomplish certain kinds of goals. Right? It's because we have these organs that accomplish these goals, and because of the way they all fit together, that makes us the kind of thing we are. So I'm essentially a rational animal. On Aristotle's view, that makes me an animal, and so I have the same kinds of parts that the rest of the animals have. Right? I'm sensitive to pain and pleasure and that kind of thing. But I'm also a rational animal, and that gives me additional organs to play with, and the way that all those organs fit together makes me a different kind of thing. Now, Aristotle thinks that the kind of thing you are is the essence of what you are. But the essence of what you are is characterized by the role you play. And so it looks very functional. It looks like the way that modern science would talk about functionalism. Remember when Aristotle says that if the eye were an animal, sight would be its soul. Right? Sight is the role that it plays in the greater animal. Right? So sight would be its soul because that's the function that it plays for the animal. Animals need to see. They have eyes for seeing. The eye sees. And so it plays this role for the overall animal. So the eye has a soul. The animal also has a soul. And the animal's soul is partly made of that eye's soul. Now today we talk about this in terms of functionalism, where there's no deep essence, it's just the role you play. And so the question you might ask here is agency a kind of thing? Is being an agent an essential property of a thing? Right? Does it make it that kind of thing? Or does being an agent amount to the role it plays in the system? Maybe some things are agents in certain systems, and they're not agents in other systems. Right? That's the kind of functional view. That what agency amounts to is the role it plays in the system that it's engaged with. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about agency. But the same thing holds, you might think, for persons. Is there an essential character to a person? Or is being a person does that just mean playing a certain kind of role in a social system, in a political system? Having a mind, being a human. Or we can start talking about these kinds of properties, high-level properties, in functional terms. And Aristotle kind of gives us a picture in which we can do this. Now, so this sort of nested hierarchy of agents that play functional roles, I think this is very modern. And we're going to look later on, let me go back to the, oops, Yeah, so if we go back to the syllabus, right now we're talking about Aristotle. Next week we'll talk about Kant. We'll also talk about biological systems a little bit more. But then in week 6 we're going to talk about neo-mechanisms, the complex systems theory, but also the mechanical theories of organization. And we'll see that the mechanical theories of organization today look a lot like Aristotle's view 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago. So it looks really modern, but there's some things that are very not modern about it. In particular, there's no room for the self. When Aristotle's talking about what humans are, he's talking about what humans are as a kind, as a species, maybe. He wouldn't use the word species, because that's a Latin word, but right, the kind of creatures that we are. I mean, he's not talking about you in particular, being a specific person, being an individual, right? So he's not talking about selves, he's not talking about individuals. He's also, because he's not talking about selves, he's also not talking about self-organization. How organ systems shape themselves. On Aristotle's view, an organ system is that way because that's the kind of thing that it is, and different kinds have different systems, and there's lots of different kinds, but Aristotle doesn't explain how those kinds come into being. He doesn't have a genealogy or generative story. The way we do today, right? We have evolution today that explains how very simple things can eventually become very complex things. So we can understand how all these different kinds all start out from the same kind. Aristotle was too early for that, so there's no self-organization, there's no individuals, there's just particulars of a kind. So the next couple of slides I want to look at some trees of life. I just want to sort of make sure that we see how this stuff looks somewhat modern. So this is from an article. Here, I can actually show you the page. This is Symmetry of Man-Made Objects. This is an article from 2011. It's a few years old. But what they did is they took CAD designs from like an AutoCAD program, a 3D modeling program, where they were designing these artifacts like chairs and bicycles and wheels and so on. And they were using the CAD design to generate the hierarchy of components. Let's go back into the slideshow. So here's a desk chair. Desk chair has this hierarchy of components where there's the back and the seat and the armrest and the base. And you can take the CAD design and go through and figure out how the components relate to each other and sort of reconstruct this hierarchy of components. And the idea here is that each component plays a functional role, right? The back serves one purpose, the seat serves a different purpose, the base serves a different purpose, and they all hook together in various ways. And so you can understand the functional decomposition of these artifacts by looking at the parts and the role they serve. So we think about artifacts today in these functional hierarchy terms. When I say hierarchy, I just mean a tree that looks like this. We'll talk a little bit about network theory, hopefully, next week. But a hierarchy is just a tree like this where there's a root node and sort of branching subnodes. Right? So you can go to the basic parts and build up the whole thing from these parts, where each part plays a role in the overall structure. And there's a bunch of different roles to play. Right? So the parts that play the role of the armrest are going to be different from the parts that play the role of the base or the seat, because those are doing different things. This should all be, I think this is all intuitive. I'm just sort of tying this into the intuitions that we have and showing how these intuitions, these are not new intuitions, these are intuitions that Aristotle had 2,500 years ago. Functional organization, the great chain of being. So nowadays we don't talk about a great chain of being the way that Aristotle did, especially that it's any kind of neat hierarchy. Nowadays the way that we talk about this structure and relationships between the plants and the animals and the human beings looks like this. So I'm going to show you a couple of different versions of the tree of life. In some sense, this is my favorite. So the way this works is 4 billion years ago is when the Earth started, and as we radiate away from that center, we get closer and closer to the present day. So today is all the way around this rim is the creatures that are alive today. And as we go from this rim back towards the center, we go to earlier and earlier creatures. Right? So the first kinds of creatures were bacteria, of course. And they were, almost half a billion years after the Earth started. You have these old bacterial creatures forming. They start differentiating. Eventually, they get different enough that they start doing different things. Everything after this point are the eukaryotes. Eukaryotes have nucleic organelle separate from the rest of the organelles. They have more sophisticated internal structures. The bacteria and the archaea are a lot simpler in structure. Notice the viruses aren't on here either. Okay, so as we go, each one of these branches are branches in the tree of life, and you can see that some of these branches dead end long before the present day. So every dead end branch that doesn't get to the present day is an extinct species, is an extinct branch of the tree of life. And in fact, you can see that there's these major mass extinction events. What these little graded lines are the mass extinction events. So the Cambrian explosion is a huge explosion in life, right? So the tree rapidly expands out to lots of different kinds of creatures. But then you can see that there's these mass extinction events where lots of creatures die out and the tree shrinks. It expands a couple of times, but it shrinks a couple of times also. Right here, this big gap here is where all the dinosaurs died out. That was the mass extinction event 65 million years ago. One of the big lessons that I think a lot of people don't fully appreciate from evolution is that all of the creatures alive today, every single one of the creatures alive today, including the bacteria, are just as highly evolved as every other creature. The mammals and the human beings, we're not more evolved than all the creatures. We've been around for just as long of a time, right? So you can trace all of us back to the original creatures, and so all of the creatures alive today are on branches that have survived this whole time. So all of these creatures have gone through as long of an evolutionary process as all the others. In this sense, we're just as highly evolved as all the other creatures. What makes us unique is not that we're more evolved, it's just that we're more specialized, we're more differentiated. We've gone through more of these branching nodes, whereas the bacteria have not branched as often as we have. Right? We're down here, sort of extreme branching. Right, so the organization, Aristotle wants to distinguish between the merely nutritive, the sensitive, and the rational creatures. But if you look at the tree of life, it doesn't seem very clear where to draw those distinctions. In fact, there's some creatures that are more closely related to the animals than to the plants, like the coral or sponges. Coral, a coral reef. Right? These are animals. Biologically, these are animals. Biologically, all the things in this picture are animals. None of them are plants. None of them are plants because they don't use photosynthesis. And if you look at the tree of life, right, the plants branch out way back here, and the coral and the sponges branch out much later. Right? So these are separate branches, and these branches are more closely related to the rest of the animals than they are to the plants. So, I mean, Aristotle might look at coral reefs and think that these are mostly plants because, look, they're just sitting there, they're not going anywhere. They don't have nervous systems, they don't seem to be responsive to pain, pleasure, this kind of stuff. So Aristotle might classify these as plants, but on the tree of life, they look a lot more like animals. Right? This kind of throws Aristotle's divisions into question. Let's look at a couple of other trees of life that might be instructive for how the natural world organizes itself. So here on the left is from Hug et al. 2016. There's a link to the article on the PowerPoint slide. So this, just as we go down this branch, we're getting closer to the modern world, the eukaryotes. Remember, in this thing, all of these things, everything to the right of this branch is a eukaryote. But here, the eukaryotes are sort of the very tail end. And this is really to classify all the bacteria. Lots of different branches on the bacterial branch. In fact, the diversity in this range is incredible compared to what happens later on in the eukaryotes and so on. Right, so this tree of life makes all the eukaryotes seem pretty important because there's a lot of differentiation, but there's a lot of genetic diversity that's not being rendered there in the bacteria and the very simple organisms. So there's a lot of room to make this tree of life at the simple end even more complicated. And in fact, this is just bacteria on the left. On the right here, they have the bacteria also grouped on the same tree of life as all the viruses. So here's around this rim all the viruses from the very complex viruses. Some of these complex viruses can get very complex. For the very simple viruses, some of the simplest viruses are just little strands of RNA. Don't do much more than sort of float around as a strand of RNA. And you can see that it's part of the same connected tree of life, that viruses are just much, much simpler versions of all the rest of the organisms, right, fit on the same tree of life. So this is maybe a way of rethinking the structure of the great chain of being. Nowadays, we don't really have a great chain of being. We have this much more complicated network. That's a web of life. But even in the individual organisms, Aristotle also helps us think about the organization and structure of the organisms. If you open up any anatomy textbook, you'll often hear people say that, or you hear the textbook say that human beings have 11 different organ systems. Right? So the reproductive system, skeletal system, muscular system, integumentary system. Is it the skin system? Yeah, I think that's skin. Nervous system, circulatory system, endocrine system, fat system, digestive system, respiratory system. Each one of these systems is composed of lots of different organs. And each of these organs do different work for that system, and then each of these systems fit together for the whole organism. Right, so even for individual, right, so not just across the whole evolutionary scale are the organisms differentiated, but also on individual organ per organism basis, there's this organizational complexity. And you're not merely your biological organs, right? So these organs are all built by your genetics, but in addition to all this biological organization generated from your genes, there's also all the creatures that live on you. There's something like 10 times more non-human cells than there are human cells in your body. Something like 100 trillion microbial cells in your body, 10 times more than the human cells in your body. Now, human cell, there's more by weight, so this is 10 times by number, and bacterial cells, your microbiome, a bunch of really, really small organisms. So the human cells are bigger, right? They have more mass to them, but the number of cells is dwarfed by the number of creatures you carry around with you. You carry around in your gut, helping you digest food, in your intestines, helping you digest food, all over your skin, all over you. In fact, not just on your skin, but you carry around with you a little microbial cloud of organisms that waft around in the air with you. And the cloud, it's mostly you can sample the cloud of microbes just wafting around in the air around you. You can sample that cloud and use that cloud of microbes to identify you uniquely, distinguish you from other people, because your microbial cloud is different from other microbial clouds. And it mostly just follows you around where you go. So if you're walking around to the park, you're going to get the microbes from that park, and you're going to carry them around with you. And so you can tell who you are, you can tell where you've been from just looking at these microbes. Even though these microbes don't share your DNA, in fact, there's a lot more non-human DNA in your body than there is human DNA. There's about 22,000 human genes in your body. There's about 3.3 million non-human genes, non-redundant human genes in your body. Non-redundant, non-human genes in your body, and genes from other creatures floating around in your body. So you're a very complex creature. Right? These microbes aren't just sort of parasites sitting on you. They're absolutely essential for your health and well-being. Right? You survive as an organism partly because of the careful balance of microbes that you carry around with you all the time. Right? 90% of human diseases can be traced in some way to the health of the microbiome. It's very important. So this is the last thing I want to talk about, and this will sort of set us up for next week. So we're still talking about organization, functional differentiation. What we're missing so far from Aristotle is the sense of self-organization. This is what we're going to get from Kant next week. Kant's the first person to really talk about self-organizing. And just to relate this to this biological discussion, I wanted to talk briefly about the chematon. So both of these are images of the chematon. This is supposed to show you that these are actual mathematical models. So these arrows are depictions of a mathematical model that relates these different parts. But the chematon is supposed to be a model of the cell, a model of a self-sustaining organized system. The chematon is supposed to be the simplest possible organizing system. These are the essential parts that you need in order to be a self-reproducing system. So this is theorized by Hungarian biologist Tibor Ganti in the 1970s. The chematon has three parts. Three parts to the chematon. These three parts all work together to build the chematon itself. These are, like I said, these are both images of the same structure. This just has the labels to make sure it's clear what's going on. There's three parts. There's the first part is the metabolism of the system. So the metabolism is the energy processing part of the system. So for the chematon, it's not a closed system, it's an open system. It takes in energy, nutrients from the outside. It takes in these nutrients and it feeds them into this metabolism where the nutrients are broken down into food. The food is used as energy. That process produces some waste, and that waste has to be expelled from the system. But that process also produces material that goes into the other parts, right? So energy and raw material that goes into serving the other parts of the system. There are two other parts of the system. One of the parts of the system is the genetic code, right? The DNA, the RNA, information processing. Right? So metabolism is energy processing. This big circle is the energy processing system. Takes in nutrients, processes it in a certain way to produce raw materials that get fed into the genetic system. Here's the genetic system. It's another circle. The genetic system takes in these nutrients, and what the genes do is it regulates the whole process. So it controls. It's a control process. It controls how this metabolism runs. It controls other things that are going on within the chematon. And this control module contains information for about how to control the whole system. Right, so there's this metabolism running. It gets controlled by the DNA. The other thing that the metabolism produces is the parts that go to create this membrane. So there's a membrane that surrounds the whole system. The membrane is permeable, so it still lets in nutrients, it still lets out waste. But it's selectively permeable, so it only lets in some things. And the idea is that this membrane encloses the whole system, and it keeps conditions on the inside that are conducive towards the rest of the function. Right, so that metabolism will only keep functioning if kept within certain temperatures, certain chemical compositions, and the membrane ensures that within this chematon, those happy conditions are sustained. It's able to keep those happy conditions partly because it's always taking in nutrients and expelling waste, and the metabolism is helping do that. It's also able to keep these conditions because there's this genetic component that regulates the whole system to keep it within those narrow bounds. So the chematon is supposed to be the simplest kind of self-organizing system. Self-organizing in the sense that all the parts of the system go into maintaining the other parts of the system so that the whole system hangs together as a functional whole. This is self-organization, right? This is what it means to be self-organized. Not just that you have functional parts, but that those functional parts do everything that's required to keep the whole functional system functioning. Right? This is the kind of thing that Aristotle didn't quite understand that we needed. He understood that there was this functional architecture, but he didn't understand how the functions themselves would be enough to keep the whole system running. That didn't come for 1,500 years later until Kant, where Kant is the first one who understands both what it means for modern science to be mechanistic, and he understands how self-organization can happen within this mechanistic framework. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. I've been talking for a long time. I will see you all on Tuesday. We'll wrap up any questions that you have about this material, and we'll talk about Kant and self-organization. Let me remind you one more time that you have your thought paper due next week. It's going to have to be on some of the material we're covering this week. So make sure you not only pay attention to lectures, but that you also do the readings. Right? There's readings from Aristotle, and I have some discussion of how these readings from Aristotle hook into the general discussion of autonomy that we're talking about. Readings from Kant for next week. I also have this big section on modern mechanical theory. In particular, I have a lot of readings from Bill Bechtel. He's a guy at UCSD. He's a living philosopher. Talks about mechanistic theories. And he gives a lot of discussions of how biological mechanisms self-organize, how that self-organization can be autonomous, and so on. So I strongly recommend reading these papers. I also, let me just put in a pitch for these papers by Evelyn Fox Keller on self-organization. It's called Organisms, Machines, and Thunderstorms, A History of Self-Organization. these are philosophical papers, but they're not really trying to argue any point, except for looking at the history of talking about self-organization, from Kant all the way through modern cybernetics, modern science, thermodynamics, and so on. She does not talk about Aristotle, and I think it's a little bit of a weakness of these papers. But apart from that, these papers are really, really easy to read. They're really fun to read. So do the readings. Come on Tuesday to talk about. Oh, I wasn't actually showing you the screen. Let me show you the screen. Yeah. So Aristotle this week. Make sure you do your thought papers. Make sure you look at Kant, the neo-mechanists. When you go into the class notes, all the readings from Aristotle, how Aristotle's views relate to modern discussions of autonomy, Kant's views, but then all these mechanistic views. In particular, I want to recommend the Evelyn Fox Keller articles, Organisms, Machines, and Thunderstorms. These are very, I like these papers a lot. They're a lot of fun to read. She starts with Kant. She goes over the history of science, of self-organization. If you're interested in science, if you're interested in modern, especially the modern views, I strongly recommend these Evelyn Fox Keller articles. It's philosophical articles, but she's an anthropologist, a philosopher and anthropologist. They're just really well-written papers. All right, I hope that was a tolerable amount of time. I'll see you all on Tuesday.